Sure.
One more minute and then we'll start. Okay. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to panel 6 of the webinar series, Indigenous Peoples, Heritage and Landscape in the Asia Pacific, Knowledge Co-Production, Policy Change, and Empowerment. Before we start and introduce the panel, we would like to acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, the Department of Anthropology, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and Asia Pacific Center at UCLA acknowledge the Gabrielino Tonga peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. We are grateful for the support of the Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research through the webinars on the Future of Anthropology grant, the Henry Luce Foundation, the New England University First Peoples' Rights Center, the National Chenji University Center for Taiwan, Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies, or CITIPILS, the UCLA Cotten Institute of Archaeology, and the UCLA Asia Pacific Center. The UCLA Department of Anthropology, UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies, University of Hawaii at Manoa Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Ifugao State University, the Partido State University, and the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement are co-hosts of the webinar series. The panel 6 focuses on the Pacific region, and as we know, it's a vast region that you can fit all of the continents inside, including Greenland. The region is diverse culturally, historically, geographically. And so we hope that this panel will provide us with um, knowledge about the Pacific. I'm my colleague and friend, Professor Dawe Kwan, and the co-convener of this webinar series will introduce the panel.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. It's my honor to introduce you the panel. The history and identity of Pacific Islander has been drastically blended by European centers' narrative because of a century of colonization. Archaeological work and community stories are helping to rethink this narrative through Pacific historiography. Descendants and local communities embody knowledge and belief systems that are often critically important to heritage preservation of places and monuments. Not only are traditional method and native technique relevant to conservation practice, but also the social and spiritual meaning of a place is unique to the indigenous cultures and perhaps known only to its practitioners. Using example from the Solomon Island, Easter Island, and Puna Bay, the panel discussed how community stories are helping to regain what was lost because of colonial imposition. This panel highlights that collaboration among local, indigenous, and international stakeholders is a space for inclusive co-production of knowledge for a better appreciation of history. So I will like to have Mehdi to introduce our panelist and moderator. Mehdi.
Thank you, Professor Daya. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you our 4 panelists and our moderator. So our first panelist is Dr. Tarcitius Kabuta Ulaka. He is an associate professor and chair director of the Department of Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, or UHM. Kabuta Ulaka is a political scientist with research interests on geopolitics, international interventions, regionalism, governance, natural resources, and economic development and political developments in Oceania. He has published extensively on China and the Pacific Islands, the Solomon Islands civil unrest, and the Australian-led regional intervention, the forestry industry in Solomon Islands, and on governance issues in the Pacific Islands. He is the co-editor with Greg Fry on Intervention and State Building in the Pacific, The Legitimacy of Cooperative Intervention, Manchester University Press, 2008. Kabuta Ulaka is the editor of the Pacific Islands Monograph Series, PIMS, and a member of the editorial board of the Contemporary Pacific. He has a PhD from the Australian National University and undergraduate and MA degrees from the University of the South Pacific, or USP. He joined UHM in 2009. Prior to that, he was a research fellow at the East-West Center's Pacific Islands Development Program and previously taught at USP. Kabuta Ulaka is from the Solomon Islands. Our second panelist today is Dr. John A. Peterson. Dr. Peterson is an anthropological archaeologist specializing in historical ecology and landscape studies. He has worked in the American Southwest, Texas, northern Mexico, China, Congo, Brazzaville, Ecuador, and currently in the Philippines. Dr. Peterson has worked with environmental justice projects in the U.S. borderlands of the lower Rio Grande Valley of El Paso on archaeological surveys for tribal groups and community archaeology projects, including the restoration of the historical Socorro Mission in Socorro, Texas, where he organized finding and collaboration with at-risk students of the Texas criminal justice system, the Meadows Foundation, and Cornerstones Incorporated, a nonprofit organization engaged in adobe restoration. In San Carlos, or in the Philippines, he has conducted community archaeology programs through the University of San Carlos Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History Community Mapping and Heritage Preservation Program. And he has worked extensively on heritage programs with the freely associated states of Micronesia and Pohnpei, the Marianas, and also in Guam. He has served on the State of Texas State Board of Review, the State of Hawaii Historic Preservation Board, the Guam Historical Preservation Board, and landmark commissions in San Elizario, El Paso, and Socorro, Texas. Peterson is currently president of the International Committee for Archaeological Heritage Management, a scientific committee of ICOMOS in support of the World Heritage Program. He is a visiting professor at the University of San Carlos and an affiliate faculty with the Department of Anthropology, University of Hawaii. Our third panelist is Dr. Britton Shepherdson. He is a senior lecturer at Northern Arizona University and a Pacific Island archaeologist with 20+ years of experience researching sustainability and human-environment interactions on Easter Island. He is the founder and director of Taravaka Archaeological Outreach, TAO, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to collaborative and educational work with the island's youth. After 17 years, more than 200 island students have graduated from TAO, taking on numerous research and conservation projects and co-authoring 15 manuscripts published in academic journals. Shepherdson is currently contracted by the National Council of Monuments of Chile to develop the island's first comprehensive Monitoring Intervention Plan for Archaeological Heritage within the island's National Park Zone. The project represents a collaborative effort between the National Council of Monuments, the island's Council of Elders, the Technical Secretary of Easter Island Heritage, the Padre Sebastian Englert Anthropological Museum, and Mauhanua, the indigenous body of park administrators. Our fourth panel member today is Bino Atan, who was born and raised on Easter Island, the most remote island in the Pacific Ocean. Benno got a degree in computer science and tried to work in that job, but was always drawn to the outdoors. Several years ago, he got hooked into working as a tour guide at an ultra-luxury hotel chain on Easter Island. There, he learned how to create experiences for travelers by not only teaching them about the sites, but also actively getting them out into the wilderness, trekking, diving, mountain biking. He became so good that he was put into an administrative position as an exploration manager. Though it was a promotion, it pulled him away from being outdoors, and so he left the position and left the island in order to continue to grow professionally. After working as the director of expedition development, Metropolitan Touring asked him to lead the whole area, and today he is regional director of research and development based in Quito, Ecuador. He still travels all around Central and South America looking for opportunities to build exploration lodges and develop expedition cruises. In addition, he has developed software to analyze locations based on the terrain, cultural diversity, and other factors to advise the company on whether a tour is viable. He is most passionate about the work that he does because it promotes environmental conservation and cultural awareness. He was involved in developing the experience of Mashpee Lodge that serves to conserve land around it. He has also gained a huge appreciation for how experiences in nature entice an emotional and life-changing response from his travelers. Bino admits that the hardest part of his life is being on the road all the time and being away from home. He returns to Easter Island for big holidays and special occasions. He knows he will go home one day, but he knows this work opportunity only comes around once in a lifetime. And our moderator today is Jason Troop. Jason is professor and chair at the Department of Anthropology, University of California, Los Angeles, where he specializes in the fields of medical and psychological anthropology. Dr. Troop has conducted extensive ethnographic research on human subjectivity, empathy, morality, and suffering in cultural context. Spending more than 19 months engaged in ethnographic research on the cultural and moral configuration of experiences of pain and suffering in Yap, an island located in the Western Pacific Ocean, Dr. Troop has sought to explore how Yapese orientations to suffering can inform a number of ongoing debates in philosophy and social theory broadly defined. He is the author of the book Suffering and Sentiment, Exploring the Vicissitudes of Experience and Pain in Yap, from 2010 University of California Press. And he is co-editor of Toward an Anthropology of the Will, 2010 Stanford University Press, and The Anthropology of Empathy, Experiencing the Lives of Others in Pacific Societies, 2011 Berghahn Press. And so with that, I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Jason Troop, to carry on our discussion concerning Pacific histories.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you to everybody for being here. I feel really honored to be part of this discussion, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. I think for anyone who has spent significant time in the Pacific, working, living, being part of communities in the Pacific, it becomes clear quite quickly that landscape is living. It's part of communities. There's intergenerational connections. There's complex relations that happen with land and landscape. So I'm really excited to hear from everyone here, their experience doing the work they do in Pacific landscapes. I'm very, very excited for this invitation. So I guess I'll just ask each of the participants to begin by just saying something very briefly about their work. I mean, we've had kind of the formal introduction, and I'm hoping there's going to be a more informal conversation. Because of that, if you don't mind, I'm just going to use first names. Call me Jason, and I'll call you by your first names if that's okay. So maybe we'll just go around and people can say a few words about what they do. And I'll start with Tara. Do you want to start?
Thank you, Jason. And first, I'd like to take the opportunity to join others in thanking the organizers for inviting me and having me on this panel. I must say that after I said yes to Boboy, I was wondering, what is a political scientist doing on this panel? And what do I know about this stuff? And so, as you heard from the introduction, much of my work nowadays focuses on geopolitics, particularly Chinese engagements with the Pacific Islands. But what I'm gonna be talking about today are things that I've been thinking about and talking to others about. And we're organizing a panel for the Pacific History Association conference, which was supposed to happen this year in Fiji, but because of the pandemic, won't happen until next year. So that's what the work is working towards. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Maybe next we could hear from Benno.
Of course. Hello, everyone. Kind of like I have the same wondering of Tarcitius. What am I doing in a panel like this? But thank you for inviting me. As Maddie was saying, I'm born and raised in Easter Island, small community, just 5,000 people, very remote island, very famous. Got drawn to tourism, and today I just travel through all Central and South America looking for opportunities of how to develop new opportunities for tourism, but in a way that how you go to have it, the places, they need to have a huge amount of potential to create conservation and show value to the communities and everything around it. So, for example, when I travel and I go to look for a place, if there's no any community that could be effective in a positive way, we might not gonna select that property. If there's nothing that we can preserve, if there's not enough land to create awareness on the biodiversity of the place, we might not gonna select that place. And I don't know, very briefly, but that's what I do. You kind of like travel a lot, live in a backpack, but looking for these opportunities. It's a huge, obviously, investment, but you need to be very to have a very good eye to how to find the right place to create shared value with the communities.
Thank you so much. John, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you. And if it's okay, I want to show a few images here. Share screen. I want to talk a little bit about the World Heritage Site of Nan Madol in Pohnpei, in the basically in the center of the Western Pacific. This is the site. It's quite a huge array of monumental structures on Pohnpei. Here you can see how it actually it's located in the southeastern portion. And this, one of the central ceremonial areas of Nandawas, kind of gives you a sense of the incredible structures at this site. One of the things that's ironic about this, though, is that even though the community has been very proud to share this with the rest of the world and as part of their cultural and historical identity, it has a kind of a black history. And this site, Pankitel, for example, was thought to have been one of the earliest structures. And here, supposedly an early chief of the Saudalur dynasty was buried. One of the earliest archaeologists to work on this site dug up the grave, and on his way from Pohnpei, he died of a heart attack suddenly. And then on another occasion, a shipload of artifacts leaving Nan Madol had a shipwreck near the Marshall Islands and lost all the artifacts. So there is, in the Pohnpeian sense, this is not necessarily something that they want to see preserved, because it's emblematic of a very almost evil part of their history. But at the same time, the structure is beginning to decay. And so when it was inscribed on the World Heritage List, it also was listed as one of the endangered monuments. So what I would like to share later in this discussion, if you're interested, is some of those issues which the Western experts with ICOMOS are being sensitive about, but nonetheless kind of have a different idea about preserving the monument, whereas the local people have many indigenous ways of resolving these conservation issues with very low impact. And there's a kind of a conflict emerging about that. So with that in mind, I just wanted to introduce you to the site because the pictures tell quite a bit about the conflict going on there. Thanks. Stop share.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Britton, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, start off by, again, just thanking the session organizers. This is a real privilege, and I kind of feel like I'm out of my league here, considering the other panelists' experience. Thank Jason for moderating. Try not to get too rowdy here. Make life easy for you. I started about 20 years ago as a research archaeologist dedicated to work on Easter Island. And it was a very immediate and emotional connection I had with the island. Just fell in love in my first trip there. And I noticed right away that at that time I was one of just really a handful of gringos living for a long period of time on the island. And it didn't take me long to realize that local people on the island were far more concerned with whether I was going to be at the discotheque on a Friday night or at my soccer game on a Sunday afternoon than any of the research I was conducting on the island. And to me, that presented a real disconnect of what the goals were of, say, the National Science Foundation and the University of Hawaii at the time, versus what the local interests were in seeing archaeologists working on their island. And so while I started off looking at topics like monumentality, territoriality, and even colonization on Easter Island, my attention quickly shifted to developing educational outreach opportunities for local students on Easter Island, particularly high school aged. And it's now become it's kind of taken on a life of its own, Theravaka Archaeological Outreach. It is a formal not-for-profit program. And I was lucky enough to meet Beno about 10 years ago on the island. And through many conversations with Beno, learning a lot about how to speak the language of the tourism industry and how to get buy-in from some of the private sector on Easter Island, and designing really engaging educational curriculum for both local and indigenous students on the island. So I'm happy to say that we've got more momentum than ever at this point, and hopefully even expanding into additional locations in South America in the near future.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think we're already in it. We're already starting to answer some of the questions we had in our first kind of segment. We have 4 segments lined up with different thematics, and the first one is thinking about how we define engaged scholarship and engaged work. And I think some of these questions have been sort of answered already, but I think it's worth moving through them. So I think just to step out, in a more distant way, I just wanted to ask the panelists, and anyone can start first, just to reflect on how you would define engaged scholarship or engaged research. How do you think about engagement as a scholar, as somebody who's trying to produce knowledge, however that knowledge is being used?
If I may, Jason, very quickly, and others can add. I think a lot of the discussions of engagement, and we've seen it in the previous panels as well, focuses on engagement between scholars and communities. And that's important. It's important that we have that engagement, actually a partnership between local communities, so that that scholarship doesn't end with the university scholar coming in, but continues within the community afterwards. But what I'm also interested in, and I think John has alluded to this, is that engagement is not only between people, but also between scholars and landscapes and seascapes. And thinking of landscapes as not only a site for research and for scholarship, but a partner in this scholarship. And I think that's important for Pacific Islands for a number of reasons. And one of which is that a lot of our histories and stories, or if we take away the word history and just use the word stories, a lot of our stories are inscribed onto these landscapes and seascapes. And so viewing landscapes as partner in scholarship, I think, is important.
I would add for me, you know, in the trial and error process or the course of learning, engaged scholarship for me, I've come to understand, is necessarily letting go of some of the more, I guess, selfish or personal research interests I once had as an archaeologist, and opening my mind to contemporary concerns of the local community, potential obstacles in efforts such as sustainable development, and reformulating my research questions based on, like I say, letting go of my original academic interests a little more.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to that question? I was going to say one thing that I experienced, and I think others have as well, working in the Pacific, and I really agree with Tara's point, you know, about the land being one of the central relations in the seascapes. A relation is how you get pulled in. I think the one view of engagement that gets put out there is it's the scholar who's initiating the engagement. But my experience was the opposite. I mean, I was engaged, but I mean, really pulling me in, it was the community telling me, you know, this is how we want you to be, how you should be, and also continuing those relations. It's not like you work somewhere like YAP and then leave. You're constantly, it's a lifelong commitment to real relationships. So I thank everybody who's taught me that over the years. So I just wanted to add that point.
And if very quickly, if I may add, Jason, and after this, I'll shut up and let the other panelists contribute. But if I may add, and that also speaks to methodology on how you go about doing it. And we are trained, I come from a small village on the weather coast of Guadalcanal in Solomon Islands. And I went to university, and I'm trained to go out and gather knowledge, to go out and gather information as part of that scholarly approach. But over the years, I think, you know, going out and gathering is important, but it is equally important, particularly in Pacific societies, to wait for knowledge to come to you. And so research methodology that involves waiting. And that process of waiting is the process of building relationship that you talk about, that it comes only after you have built that relationship, after you have proven that you can engage and be part of the community.
Yeah, that really resonates strongly with my experience. Thank you so much. So why don't we move on to the second question? And I think what we were just discussing in terms of relations and sort of these living relations between people in communities and land and seascapes and orientations. We talked about history, stories. So this question is about, you know, in what way do you see the community stories empowering Pacific communities? And I also, as I'm going to inject this myself, is stories the right term because it seems like so much of this is about experience and lived realities. It's not just a story someone's telling about the land. Sure, it's related, but there's also these very strong connections that I think exceed the story. So I'll just open it up there, and anyone who wants to jump in, please do. But stories are okay too, so we can talk about stories and empowerment.
Well,
Yeah,
I don't want to tell any tales out of school, but you may have the same experience on Yap. But a lot of times when you talk to Pompeians, you don't get the whole story, and they're kind of proud of this. This is their way of communicating. That they'll tell you a lot, but they'll leave some important things out. You have to hear the story told many different times before you begin to hear different versions and different parts of it that were kind of excluded to begin with. And they think it's funny when like consultants drop in out of the sky all over the Pacific and of course are the immediate experts on everything. And I think Pacific Islanders find it kind of amusing that they can tell their stories in this way. And then if the people aren't long-term participants and aren't respectful listeners, they really won't get that point. Did you see that in Yap too?
Definitely. I mean, secrecy is essential to how people think about their position in relation to land and a whole bunch of things. So what gets told to whom and how much? I mean, I love this concept of waiting. You have to wait for knowledge, and even then it might not come, if you haven't shown yourself to be the right kind of person to receive it. So yeah, in that sense, there's definitely power involved, because it's not just giving these stories to anybody. Yeah, I definitely resonate.
And if I may jump in again, Jason, storytelling is not only about the storyteller, it is about the listener as well. And the listener and participant is as equally important in the process of telling story as the storyteller is. And every time a story is told, it's never the same as when it was previously told. And you're absolutely right. Like take, for instance, my stories about my family's rights to land. Those are not stories that we go around telling everybody, because there is power associated with it. And these, so when we talk about landscapes in Pacific places, and I am certain it's the same in other parts of the world as well, what we're actually talking about are stories that are written onto landscapes. So land tenure systems are actually stories that are written onto particular landscapes. And whoever has monopoly over those stories, therefore has rights to land. So we're not talking about land per se, but we're talking about rights over stories that are written onto different landscapes.
Yeah, thank you. Benno, I wanted to ask you, in terms of your work, to what extent is, there's certainly an empowerment piece that's really central to it, but also thinking about knowledge and what's shared, what stories are told. How do you deal with that in your work?
I mean, for me, just to begin with, when we grew up in Easter Island, there was not even a small electricity, no TVs, nothing. You grew up with the stories that your uncles, your grandparents, your parents, everyone tells you about. So the island was divided by different tribes. Every family on the island can trace their genealogy back to that tribe, and each family have their own version of how the statues were moved, how the warfare between the tribes, if it was cannibalism before or not. So we grew up with this very strong sense of what you family tells you, and you get that feeling of the stories that they tell you. You grew up with that, but then the planes start getting more often. You start seeing more gringos, like Britton was saying before, and they just come with these crazy ideas. I think Easter Island for many years have been working as a trampoline for many people. They just come and listen to one story there, listen to another story over there, and they create their own view, and they just go out and publish. Yeah, and I've seen, and we always make fun with Britain about the Asian elephant in Easter Island moving the statues around the island. It's I mean, and then it gets more difficult when I start working in this hospitality industry, and I started as a guide, and I was like, okay, so should I tell the story of my family? There's the story of the tribe that I belong to, or should I just say something about these archaeologists that come and they have these other different hypotheses? So it's very difficult. And every time I remember when I start guiding, I usually say, well, you probably arrived to this island with many questions, and you probably will leave with many more, because I will give you all, and you can make your own vision of what you have. And I think it has a lot of power, obviously, but sometimes then when I got managing positions, sometimes travelers come in and say like, you know, I'm very disappointed because I went out yesterday with that guide and he told me something that this other guy told me something totally different. And I got together with them and I said, well, they belong to different tribes. They have different oral tradition passed down generations by generations to their families. And they start getting a better idea of the whole story. But I mean, it's very tricky, but at the same time, you have a lot of power. Yeah, if you know exactly how to be a very good storyteller, it has a lot of power also.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. This idea that a story, I mean, some idea that there could be a story, a singular story, almost like from a view from nowhere. And my experience, you know, learning from folks in YAP who I know best, you know, it's always a view from some very particular perspective. And it's assumed that other people will know something very different and have a different access. And then it becomes a challenge. So what becomes scholarship in the sense where there is some demand of a view, you know, some sharedness in places where that's not assumed at all. In fact, people would think you were really naive to think that there was just one view. Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I guess this question is again, so thinking about those thinking about power and relationships and stories and the researcher or the outsider's or insider's position as somebody who's trying to engage with knowledge and bring it out of a local context to do something else with it. I wanted you all to talk a little bit about what role do local folks in the communities play in shaping the kinds of work that you do. And I know some of it's come up already in different answers, but maybe just to address it explicitly would be great. John?
In my case, I've learned a huge amount from people like Dr. Rufino Mauricio, who's actually a PhD in anthropology, a native Pohnpeian. He knows an enormous amount about the history and culture of Pohnpei. And he, for example, in one of the issues that the World Heritage Committee had about the preservation or conservation of Nan Madol was about the stonework, some of it falling out of place for a variety of reasons. And Rufino and I had a lot of discussions about how there's a whole ritual and chants associated with construction. And that actually, even when the stones are quarried, those large basalt blocks, the rocks that are placed in the interstices, the small gravels and things, there are names for all those and stories about all those. And in order to do any kind of reconstruction of Nan Madol, it's very important to know those rituals and to know those chants. And if it's not done, it's not appropriate even. Some of the World Heritage vision was, well, we should send in a recommendation to put dredges and cranes out there and muscle these things around and put them in place. And Rufino was laughing. Well, you know, Pompeians originally put these in place. They didn't need cranes 1,000 years ago to put these stones in place. What they had was the power of ritual, the power of story, and the power of the chants. So he's been a huge asset for learning and actually kind of translating a lot of these things for Westerners.
Does anyone else want to speak to that?
Sure, I'll just, my experience on Easter Island again is working with some of the least experienced storytellers in the youth of the island. And I think as Baina was alluding to, with the rise of technology on the island, it's understandable why a lot of kids these days have very little experience using storytelling as a form of communication or entertainment or empowerment for that matter. And I've certainly adapted over the years in developing curriculum from a perspective that was focused primarily on technical archaeology, research, analysis, including a component where the local kids are encouraged to document any stories or fragments of stories that they can recall as we get field experience visiting these places. And it's been great to see that, you know, one of the most overlooked portions of Easter Island's history, I think, is a proto-historic period where there was a severe bottleneck on the island based on slave raids and introduction of diseases and such. And, you know, unfortunately, I think a lot of the oral tradition was lost as a result. And for me to think that we could ever run that risk again is, you know, is terrifying. And I think it's been really interesting for me to see how these students can be, on the one hand, afraid to get into the practice of storytelling. And I think it's mostly insecurity on their part. But by the second week of the program, they won't stop talking about every little similarity or difference between, as Baina was saying, you know, their family's version of the story versus another camper in the group. And so for me, there, you know, it clearly is an important topic. And it's been really nice to see that it is possible to develop a trusting environment where these inexperienced storytellers start to take up that practice again. And, you know, as much as possible, I've tried to reassure them that it doesn't matter what your version of the story is. We want to get them all down. We want to get them documented so that we keep all of these from now on and continue the, you know, the empowering tradition.
Okay, great.
Yeah, just to add very quickly, Jason, I think, you know, I think Britton is absolutely right, and others as well. That there is always a danger to a single story. As Chimamanda, the Nigerian novelist, said that, you know, one of the biggest dangers that we have in the world is we try to create single stories. There is beauty in multiple stories. And to, you know, for the work that I'm doing, particularly trying to put together this panel for the Pacific History Association conference. And if I may very quickly go back to a little bit on the Pacific history thing. So we all know that James Davidson, at an inaugural lecture at the Australian National University in 1949, came up with the idea that there is a need to tell Pacific Island histories. Histories that are focused on Pacific Islanders, or what he called island-centered and islander-oriented history. And that sounded really wonderful. But the next question is, how do you do it? How do you go about telling histories that are Pacific Island-centered and islander-oriented? And it means, you know, exploring different ways of telling about the past, or remembering and engaging with the past. And Pacific Islander ways of thinking about that relationship that perhaps is not linear. It's not a linear relationship. But in a lot of Pacific Island places, the engagement with the past is often secular, that people engage and deal with and remember the past in different ways, that the past is never really the past. It is also with us today. And one of the things that we wanted to explore for this panel that we are organizing is how is the past remembered and told through names, and particularly names of places and names of people, and how those stories are inscribed onto landscapes, and how they are often sometimes erased, either intentionally or unintentionally. And if we look at the Pacific Islands, you have places like Solomon Islands, where I come from, for instance, because a guy called Alvaro de Mendana thought that he had found the source of King Solomon's gold. We haven't found it yet, so we're still looking for it. But he named the place Solomon Islands. And then you have Cook Islands, which Captain Cook never went there, but they named those places. And so we are exploring the fact that the process of naming is not just a process of identifying, but also a process of claiming ownership over places and writing one story over it. And here in Hawaii, for instance, one of the most popular places is Pearl Harbor. So what does Pearl Harbor mean? And what kind of stories are told to tourists when they come to Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor, the name is Puloa, which actually means something completely different. So you see the militarization of a landscape and the tourism industry. So the militourism story written onto that particular landscape. So that's what we're trying to do, to look at different Pacific places and see what names can tell us, and also names of people. So the naming of Pacific Islanders after their father is something very recent. People given different names, and every name has a story. So we remember the past through the living.
There's so much there, and I want to respond too, but I'm also conscious that we need to move on. I would love to keep talking at some point about the, and I think this is actually related to this question, but needing things like passports, and in Yap we're talking about a complex set of matrilineal clans that are negotiating over land over multiple generations, and there is no last name. But with a passport, people need to put in a last name, and it becomes, oh, what's a last name? It's the father's name. So you get people using the father's Yapese name as their last name, and it's totally confusing. It has nothing to do with how relations are reckoned, and it's very difficult. But so we're transitioning into block 2, and you've already done it for us, so thank you. That's perfect. We want to start talking about the power of landscape. And one question I didn't get to ask at the end of the last block had to do with kind of major problems and issues facing the communities you work with and how that informs your work. But I think you can have that in the background as you think about this first question for the power of landscape, which again, we've talked about in different ways, but I think it's great to make it thematic, is thinking about what institutions, both formal and informal, produce, reproduce, and control the material and cultural resources and narratives in your research area. So, my example of the passport is one example of how things get transformed and different institutions become grafted onto local practices. But the floor is open. So anything that you could speak to.
Since everybody's really quiet, I'll start us off, and others can chime in. I often ask my students at UH Manoa in terms of land. So the university is a very important but also very powerful institution. And we walk around UH Manoa and take for granted that the names and stories that are written onto that particular place, and sometimes we assume that they have always been there. So, I find the old maps of Manoa. So mapping itself is problematic, and we can go on and talk about that another time. But I often ask the students, okay, so when we go for our lectures, we go to Saunders, Moore Hall, Kew Kendall, all these buildings around campus. And these are not just buildings, but they are stories of particular individuals, mostly men, mostly dead. And I asked him, what's the story that was here prior to this place being what it is? And so asking the students to look for where the streams were, what the names of different places on campus were. And then we write those stories and then write these other stories about Saunders and all these other great people. And we layered it onto those other stories to see the different layers of stories that have existed in this one spot on campus.
Any of the archaeologists want to speak to the layering of stories? Yeah, go, John.
Jason, I could say something about governance in relation to power.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
In the Federated States of Micronesia, of course, that's a sort of it's a national entity. The state of Pohnpei is a part of the Federated State of Micronesia, as is Yap, another state. Then there are localities, but the other thing, along with these sort of formal, very Western style governance units, there's also a traditional authority in Pohnpei. Basically, it goes all the way back to the Saudalor, to the groups, the dynasty that was controlling Manmadal. And in fact, it was the breaking up of of that dynasty that led to them being distributed around the island as separate paramount chiefdoms. And each one of these paramount chiefdoms has what's called a nunmarki, who's literally the paramount chief, who has absolute power within that community, within that district. So one of the frustrations that World Heritage Center had, I think, looking at this system was, well, you've got one guy out there, I mean, and he's not, he's not educated, and oh my goodness, he's going to be running everything, you know? There was a lot of discomfort, I think, at viewing this traditional authority system. And yet it is the fundamental governance unit for traditional society in Pohnpei. So there has to be some way of dealing with, you know, the Western consciousness of this versus the internal consciousness. The Namwarki absolutely has to be respected in that community and has to be given priority. And it actually goes to the fact that Nammadal is a living landscape, like Tara was saying earlier. The landscape and Nammadal itself as a dynastic center no longer has the same function, but it's still very much a living landscape. And it's the Namwarki who's really in touch with that and able to broker that to the rest of the community. So it's essential that the paramount chiefdoms and the traditional governments be really central to this whole process, I think.
I wanted to ask Benno if it's okay, and then we'll go back to you, Breton. But I wanted to ask Benno, when you're going into kind of new communities and trying to think about possibilities in those communities, how do you think about these other these corridors of power within them, or how do they become visible to you, and how do you navigate them?
Yeah, I don't know. I was recently, well, not recently because of the COVID, right? But at the beginning of the year in a village in Colombia where non-foreigners are allowed to go there, right? And my first thought is like, if we're gonna go to visit, it's because I wanna know the heritage, but I probably will never bring anybody to this place, right? But I wanna know the heritage and what's out there, what their needs or how they live, and they're very high up in the mountains. This is the Caribbean Ocean in Colombia, but they are in La Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the Kogis community. And I don't know, everywhere where I go and where we try, I always, because I'm from an indigenous community, I always try to look to learn and to see more. And we were allowed to go, but just to the school, which is next to the village. And because the foundation let us go and talk to the teachers and to see the kids. And it's impressive how the needs of my community a while ago, you can see the same needs they're very close in many other locations, and obviously they're in danger, and they're so fragile that I was wondering myself the night before, if should we really go? It will not disturb them, but at the same time I wanted to learn a little bit about the heritage. I think having these foundations like the one the Britain have in Easter Island, it's one of the main channels to how to communicate with the community, and it's so easy to steer them in the wrong way. I mean, when I got there, the first problem that they have is trash, because they're so hot in the mountain and they like Coca-Cola and they want some French fries and they want like all these things, but they don't know how to bring all of that down. And you can see that the huge problematic that they have there. It was just trash, and how they can steer in the wrong way. They just came down to the towns just to trade things, to keep buying the same things that they don't know what to do with the plastic up there. I think having these type of foundations or not, how do you call it, NGOs, non-profit organizations, they help them to steer in the right way. If not, the indigenous communities, it's so easy to get into alcoholism, into all of these things with the trash and things like that. And it's sad. I mean, I work in tourism, but I know how much the tourism damage the planet. All the companies that we have here, we're all carbon neutral, and we have a huge portions of land to be able to mitigate all the carbon that we generate. But at the same time, we wanted to be able to help and impact in the right way with all the communities. Yeah.
Thank you. Britton, did you want to add something? Or
I was, when you asked if the archaeologist wanted to chime in on the layering of stories, and kind of in response to some of what Tarcitius was speaking to, I thought, well, my response as an archaeologist is we got a lot of work to do. And specifically, you know, my work on Easter Island has overlapped a significant amount with the tourism industry. And, you know, when I juxtapose the layering of the story that I've been let in on Easter Island by these different families and different generations and different time periods, you realize how rich and complex this layering is. And you're at the same time, as an archaeologist that interacts regularly with the tourism industry, you're working with clients who have the attention span for, you know, one tweet at a time. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done, and it falls on archaeologists, anthropologists, and the tourism industry to continue. You know, one of, I think, my goals is to continue to try to stretch the mind or the tolerance of travelers to allow the layering of stories and such to be more complex than a simple soundbite or you know, a punchline they can go home with. So yeah, my response was like, yeah, holy cow, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a disconnect between the reality of the complexity of the cultures that travelers like to visit, and that archaeologists like to study, and the threshold, I guess, that pop culture or foreign cultures are willing to take in their, you know, minimal experiences with some of these exotic cultures, right?
I'm going to try to combine a few questions here, because I know the discussion is so rich. We're probably getting close to the end of section 2. So I wanted to, thinking about within local communities, that there are, you know, different channels of power, and people have different access to certain types of knowledge, and some people have control over that knowledge and other people don't. I was wondering if you could all reflect a little bit upon how people in the communities themselves think about this kind of differential access to knowledge or power, how they navigate it in their day-to-day lives. And then also maybe thinking on the community level, if there's different factions, you know, really drastically different perspectives that are held by more than one person about what the history is, or what, you know, what the stories are, or who should have access to what. How do local people deal with that? How do you deal with it? Do you see something parallel between the way that you have to deal with it and how local people have to deal with it? Or are there differences because of your positionality? And you can take on any piece of those. I've just actually combined 3 questions. So there's a lot in there, and go for whichever piece sounds answerable.
Again, since everybody's quiet, I'll start, and you know, hopefully my colleagues will think of something and then talk about it. One of the challenges for me is, you know, taking stories that exist in a particular context, a community, stories that are negotiable, that are dynamic, and then writing those stories down, making them become static and permanent. And when I was doing my PhD at the Australian National University, I got bored of writing a PhD dissertation. So I wrote my grandfather's story, his biography, while writing my PhD, as a way of getting away from the PhD and telling stories that I had grown up with. And I was very proud when I published it, and I thought it was a wonderful thing. But as we all know, the story of individuals is often the stories of entire communities, because our stories are interwoven with each other. And so when I publish it, nowadays, when people talk about these stories, they would hold it up as the authority, that it's written in this biography. And that made me sad in a way, because I had taken one individual story and written it, and it had taken prominence in a way that I did not expect. And in a certain way, it's taken away that negotiation for stories, for you know, dynamism, for telling different kinds of stories. So that's one, you know, one experience that I had. The other thing is that in a lot of Pacific Island places, and I can speak particularly of Melanesia and especially Solomon Islands, is that when it comes to land issues, there are many competing stories. And people, you know, tell this. So land disputes or disputes over land are basically story competitions. People telling their different versions of stories that link them to that particular place. But the process of registration, which governments have pushed throughout the Pacific Islands region, what it does is it takes away that competition, that negotiation that takes place, and registers a particular story that if you disagree with, you have to go to court. The only avenue of disputing or disagreeing with that story is through the court system, a system that many people are not familiar with, or if they are familiar, do not have the money to engage with. And so, you know, when telling people stories, those are some of the things that I'm often conscious about.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to this? John?
Well, Britton and Tara both touched on this, but the audience for the stories may dictate some of what is addressed. For example, if you're doing an interpretation for tourists, there may be different stories that are told. But ultimately, I think it should be the local community and the local culture that does the telling of the stories. You know, as archaeologists, we'll go work someplace like Pohnpei or Easter Island or whatever, and our big questions are, what was the migration stream of people that came to this island, and who are they culturally affiliated with? Was this the Austronesian stream from Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera? And those are things that professionally sort of dominate the thinking of Western archaeologists. But if you go into a lot of communities, they don't really resonate with those stories. It doesn't mean too much to them. It seems to me much more meaningful to tell tourists visiting some of these sites the local stories, like both Britton and Tarcitius are saying. The local stories are going to be a lot more meaningful, and they're going to connect a lot more with that landscape. And they may actually have unanticipated spins on some of those other dominant Western models of migration. For example, no one's really sure of the different periods of people coming to or through Pohnpei, where they came from originally, maybe the Solomon Islands. It's not really sure. Was there people traveling back from the Polynesian outliers? Very likely. We're going to try to get a project going where we're working with villagers in various places where there are archaeological sites to help us understand what those sites mean to them and how they might compare to places like Samoa or the Solomons or whatever. So I think those stories really need to be brought out as the most important thing that can be used to interpret these landscapes to tourists, for example. Forget about the periods and the and the streams and this and that. It's not of much interest to the locals, I think, and it's probably the wrong message to give the tourists.
Okay, so the time is going way too fast. So we're going to switch to the third kind of block of questions that are really about heritage and sort of intergenerational aspects of heritage and some other questions. So the first question, it has to do with how it is that local communities, indigenous peoples who have these histories and heritages that span centuries or millennia, how do they think about what could and should be reclaimed or transmitted to younger generations? I mean, we've had bits and pieces of that discussed, but really thinking about the younger generations and how to transmit what people know forward in a way that lets people keep alive and keep vivid those traditions. And how do those kind of views about intergenerational transmission and the youth and the worlds that they're in, how does that inform the work you do? That's the question. Britton, I know you do a lot of this work, so maybe you should start.
Sure. You know, I some of these questions are fascinating, and at the same time, I'm thinking I can't possibly generalize what's going on across the entire island community, and so I'm hesitant to respond based on my own informal observations. You know, but I would say, yeah, it's challenging, and for me, I find to keep teenagers on Easter Island engaged year after year, despite me getting 1 year older each time. I've got to stay in tune with their interests and their primary modes of communication and such. And there's part of me that I realize I constantly come back to what I think is a growing divide I observe on Easter Island, which is, to me, is a kind of a subtle difference between preservation and conservation when it comes to heritage, that I see especially with some of the some indigenous folks that have recently taken a more active role in, say, government offices, heritage management positions, things like that. I feel like their immediate effort or goal is to kind of, let's take Easter Island tradition and put it in a glass bubble and seal it up, and nobody can hurt it in this glass bubble. Whereas to me, I feel like the more I can convince teenagers that these old traditions, these stories, the traditional knowledge, the technology is relevant today and is useful today and can provide answers to age-old questions and can be combined with modern technology. I feel like for me, at least in terms of laying out my goals with a nonprofit, I am much more committed to trying to maintain the relevance of the information that is encapsulated in stories and traditional knowledge, and showing that this could be applied every day if you thought about it long enough and thought about the lessons we have to learn from it. The other, I guess, issue I grapple with a lot, again, with students is simply, as an outsider, being the even non sequitur excuse for these kids to go talk to a grandparent or an uncle, just to, light the match for a conversation that's never been had before. I feel like there are sometimes, my observations have been that there are kind of a generational disconnect where some of the elders on the island look at the identity of some of the youngsters and think these kids aren't even Rapa Nui. They're too busy with their cell phone and their modern world. And I think a lot of the youngsters from their perspective, they're looking at these elders thinking, I'm not going to try to speak Rapa Nui because if I screw up one time, they are going to laugh me out of the house, But I think when you can provide an excuse, when I can say, hey, let's do a project on creating a ghost database across the landscape, all of a sudden, these students feel empowered because they have an excuse to go knock on an uncle's door as a cold call and start a conversation that maybe both sides deep down wish they had started 20 years ago. So that's kind of some of the main challenges I think I confront on a regular basis in initializing and formalizing a pipeline for this kind of communication and for the transmission of stories.
Benno, do you want to speak to this?
Sure. I think it's been very challenging every year. Obviously, every time I can, I always join Brett with Tao. And I think one of the strategies they also Britain was using is just to, I think he mentioned it, but having these kind of like role models. So these because they're teenagers, they're the most difficult to entertain or to manage. If they're younger kids, it's easier, or if there's adults, obviously easier, but teenagers is the ones that are more complicated. But when they see a role model, when they see a super expert guide and they have all this knowledge about the island, it kind of like start getting into a thing of and my parents never told me about that. I'd never been into that place, and we were amazed of, okay, we're gonna do a hike to this volcano, and I don't know, 70% of the kids have never been up there. So for us, we try to put a different strategy on how to get them engaged with what's out there. What stories out there, what are the legends, what are the tribes that they used to live there, and what's the unique of the place, and try to get them into that. I need to know that knowledge. I need to have that knowledge because not even my parents probably have been there. And the other thing is that the kids, they're mixed between indigenous local Rapa Nui, as myself, and you have Chileans that they live there, right? And I don't know, maybe like in Hawaii that you have the Haoles and kind of like the same thing. But you as a Rapa Nui, you cannot know. I mean, you feel ashamed if a Chilean guy who's not he's not indigenous from the island, have more knowledge or have been more times into that volcano. So you kind of like generate a competition into, we need to have this knowledge. I need to go to that volcano. I've been so many other times here. To try to keep them engaged, and I don't know, we create so many different ways to get them, and I think we succeed. We do a lot, and then when they leave next year, they just want to come back, and they want to come back into the program because they feel that they want to know more. Yeah, and for us, it's the best reward to be able to share this knowledge and so they can share it with other people back at their homes.
The other thing, Jason, and I'll just throw this in, not that I've ever tried it, but just ideas. You know, the idea of storytelling as sitting around the fire and telling the story, that's not what's happening nowadays. That there are different mediums of storytelling. And I think, you know, getting the young people to use the medium that they know to tell their stories to themselves and to others. And I'm thinking of things like films, for instance, animation, telling these stories in ways that would interest, and through medium that would interest the younger generation, or creating games that includes stories from Pacific Island places. So those are challenges that, and kids nowadays, as we all know how to use these things. I mean, my students teach me how to use Zoom and other stuff that I have no clue about. So I'm sure they know the medium. It's telling them the story that they can then retell through this other medium that's important.
John, did you want to speak to this at all, or should I move on to the next?
Well, no, just briefly, but I quite agree with that. And there's a really dynamic filmmaking revival around the Pacific Islands now by Pacific Islanders. They have film festivals in Hawaii and Guam and so forth. And that speaks to that people are really, really adept with these technologies and these storytelling modes in modern technology. I completely agree with
Let me move on to another question, which Tara had brought up earlier, but just to get everyone to reflect on it a bit in their own work. So thinking about how state or international regimes have gone about renaming and recasting the landscape with names that aren't indigenous to it. Can you reflect a little bit about how the communities themselves respond to this? What kind of orientations they have to ways of thinking about land, property, and relations to that are coming from an elsewhere, an institution or a nation that's a foreign one, even if it was in the past, a colonial institution in the past.
I'll just very quickly tell two examples. So, and while that's a brilliant idea, it's more complicated than we sometimes think. And the first example is the Cook Islands. So there is an ongoing discussion in the Cook Islands to rename the country and get rid of Captain Cook from their story and give it a name from within, from a local name. The problem is, which local name are we going to give to the country? Is it going to be Rarotonga? If it is Rarotonga, then people in the outer islands of the Cook Islands do not agree because they are not part of Rarotonga. So there's that competition going on and discussion. I'm sure our friends from there will one day resolve that issue, but as of now, not yet. And the second is there is a proposal in the Solomon Islands to reinscribe the local names for places within the capital city, Honiara. So, you know, because we are a former British colony, a lot of the names for Honiara are connected to the British monarch. We have Prince Philip Road and those kinds of things. And so they're talking about reinscribing the old names onto these places. But those names belong to people from Guadalcanal, where Honiara is located. But Honiara is no longer just a Guadalcanal place. It is the capital city with people from all over the country. And so are we trying to reclaim it as a Guadalcanal place? Or how do we include these other folks from the many islands of the Solomons who now call Honiara home? And so there are those kinds of complications, but the discussions are taking place. And I think that's the beauty of it, is having that discussion.
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear that. Well, I think this was last year. Not just because Jacob Roggeveen, these Dutch, arrived to these remote Polynesian island, and Easter Sunday, in the name of Easter Island is the right name for the island, right? And I don't know if it was last year or the year before. They already filed. The president already signed it and filed it to the Congress, and to change the official name from Easter Island to Rapa Nui, which is it's used for the three things. I mean, I'm Rapa Nui, I speak Rapa Nui, and I'm from Rapa Nui, right? There's no difficulty, and everybody will agree there that's the right name. And I think it's a huge impact to the community to be able to feel that power of being called with the right name. In Spanish, if I'm from Isla de Pascua, when I went to the mainland to study, they call me, you are a Pascuense. And I got into, in university, I got into so many fights because they called me Pascuense, they didn't call me Rapa Nui, right? And when you're from Rapa Nui, that feeling of being from that island, even though I carry a Chilean passport, it's like asking anybody from Barcelona if they're Spanish or if they're from País Vasco. I'm very happy for that. This is a case I hope that the Congress do everything that they have to do, because I would love to see a map with the name Rapa Nui instead of Easter Island on my wall.
Just to add on to that, so in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you will notice that a lot of places have two names. So that's an acknowledgement. So they have a local Maori name as well as the given English name. And to a certain extent, that is an acknowledgement of the different layers of history that exist. An acknowledgement that, yes, there are Maori names, but there are also other names as well. And that discussion came up in our discussions about renaming Honiara, that is it possible to have multiple names for the same place?
It's such a, yeah, it really is a complicated discussion.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on, Beno.
Sorry, Jason. The other thing that I want to see now that I said about Aotearoa is that every time I travel to any of the Pacific Islands, and they ask me where you're from, if I say Rapa Nui, they went, "Oh, Rapa Nui, you're from Rapa Nui!" Like everywhere in Aotearoa or in any island of Hawaii and Tahiti and everywhere. But if you travel to the other side, if you say Rapa Nui, it's like, where is that? Right? And if sometimes I've been in the States and Easter Island, I thought everybody died there. I mean, they cut all the trees and then, right? So if you go this way, you said Rapa Nui. If you go this way, you said Easter Island. The statues, the heads. Yeah, I saw the movie on the museum and stuff.
Okay, I'm getting notifications that we got about 15 minutes before we do a question and answer, and we have another whole section to talk about and some very interesting stuff in it. So now block 4, we're going to just talk about overall landscapes. Let me see if I can synthesize a few things here. Okay. Okay, so I think we can make a connection between the discussion we've been having about naming and placemaking and local and foreign institutions and how they kind of wrestle with how to think landscape and place and belonging and property and things like that. So with the theme of engagement in the background, can you say a little bit about both how local perspectives on the landscape and relations to it, and I mean, I always hesitate to use a word like ownership because it's very complicated in many places in the Pacific, what you could mean by ownership, but ownership. So how does that affect your research activity? You know, the kinds of where you can go, where you can't go, the questions you can ask, you can't ask. And then allied with that, you know, how do you think your own research may have helped folks in the community to realize their own efforts to try to regain control and management of their land if it's been displaced or taken away by other institutions or other nations? Britton?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I have two kind of very different answers to those two questions. What I've seen on Easter Island pretty consistently for the last 20 years, I've tried to conduct work there, is that it has become more and more and more complicated to get any sort of formal permission to conduct even non-invasive research with local students for the sake of education, really, rather than research. And I would say, especially in the last 5 years, it's almost, and Beno might know more about this than I do, but I feel like there has been this furious rush to fence in every parcel across the island as it is repatriated to families, whereas most of the landscape used to be, not that many people wanted to walk around as much as I did, but I could walk in any direction as long as I wanted without seeing a fence. And now, just like I say, in the last 5 to 10 years, this has become a hot issue of the ownership of these parcelas. And for me, it's really unfortunate, one, because I can no longer lead all the excursions for local students, but two, because it really has changed the landscape, you know, the viewscape in any particular area, to see barbed wire fences in every direction. In terms of how my work had an impact on any of this, I suspect it's had very little, but I will tell you, about 15 years ago, I happened to conduct a geospatial analysis of statues that for a very long time, inland statues were assumed to have been abandoned in transport as part of this purported catastrophic collapse in prehistoric Rapa Nui. I was actually able to show through statistical analyses that many, if not all, of these inland statue locations lined up quite nicely with territorial boundaries associated with families or socio-political divisions in the historic period. And as soon as I presented some of that work in the local museum, I will tell you that I had like 2 or 3 invitations from families to attend barbecues in the next few days, so they could get kind of the inside scoop on which land belonged to them. And I had to quickly, you know, step back and say, no, I don't even trust my research that far. And it certainly is going to take a lot more time. But it made me realize just how ready some of these families are to jump on an opportunity to claim land and assert their rights to it. And these days to fence it in as property. So I've definitely had personal experiences with it, but I don't know if these, again, are generalities or not.
I'll just say briefly, in my experience in Yap, I mean, the granularity is important. You know, I mean, I think one thing Yap doesn't mean there's only one place that has a non-local name, and that's Colonia. But they also call it Donguch, you know, the small islands that were there before they filled it in. So there's not a lot of tension in terms of how you name places, but knowing the name of a place, and not like a village, but let's say an estate, that is about having access to it and having ownership to it. So you don't, so I was involved in some GPS mapping and things like that, and they quickly became very contentious. And also, once names were shared, there was definitely an agreement that this document should not go anywhere. It's not, shouldn't be put on any map for general consumption with the other village, let alone, within the community. So it was guarded pretty quickly. And so I don't know if that helped or hindered or what it did, but it was good, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a bigger issue at stake, is the telling of stories or remembering pasts, and the emergence of property rights, particularly property rights as understood in today's context. And one of the things with having property rights is clearly defined entities that could be bought and sold, and titles of which can be transferred. In the past, these things are negotiable, as I mentioned earlier on, because stories are dynamic and they change. But nowadays, when you write it down and register it and put it in the registration, it becomes a property of a particular individual or particular family. So I just want to throw that in, but I wanted to raise two other issues. The first is that, in some Pacific Island places, it's difficult to tell the stories onto landscapes because the landscapes have been taken elsewhere. And I'm thinking of two places in particular, Banaba in what is today Kiribati and Nauru. And so the stories of the landscapes of these two places are now in Aotearoa, in the farms of New Zealanders, or in Australia, because they were taken as phosphate and sprinkled onto these places. And so if you think about it in another way, Banabans could say that because our stories are written onto the farms of New Zealand and Australia, we therefore have claim over those places as well. Don't tell them that, they might start doing it. But so it's difficult to tell those stories when your landscape is taken away and sprinkled elsewhere in the world. Or when your people, like in the case of Banaba, many of our listeners will probably know that they were taken out of Banaba and put on Rambi Island in Fiji. And so it is about recreating their stories in a different place. And so Banabans, if you look at Katerina Teawa's work on Banaban history, her book, Consuming Banaba, talks about how Banaba is relocated in different ways, but also the reconstruction of Banaban culture on Fijian landscape, and also trying to define themselves as different from Kiribati. So that's the first thing. The second point is that stories on landscape are also difficult to tell when your islands disappear. And so the issue of climate change, and then what happens in these instances. And that's not something that's happening or will happen in the future. In a lot of Pacific Island places, it's something that's happening now. And so the issue of stories on landscapes and disappearing landscapes.
Sorry, Jason, I just wanted to quickly add to that. As Tara was saying before, it's not just also landscape, it's also seascape. One tribe in Rapa Nui can tell you, why should you go to fish there if my sea is this side, right? So territorial territorial boundaries can be in land, but it can also be in the ocean. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw it in because it's very important, obviously, because we're Polynesians, right? So the ocean is just an extension of land.
Yeah, this is true. And then they have fish traps that are, I mean, those are owned, to use that term loosely. So I want, because we're going to have some questions that will be coming up soon. I wanted to get to a question that I think both climate change, transformations, and the idea that we're going to have and are having already climate migration. So in Yap, many people from the outer islands have moved to Yap proper. And some of that is related to directly to climate change, but it'll be increasingly so. So thinking about the kind of circulation of peoples within the Pacific as land disappears or becomes differentially viable, salt water getting into the taro patches or what have you. So thinking about that on the one hand, and then also what we've seen over the last decade, that's kind of increasing move and shift in kind of regional power. With China taking this very strong hold on many communities, sometimes through the guise of tourism. So in the Yapese case, it was about trying to transform the island into the biggest tourist destination in the Western, Micronesia. And the kinds of ways that people are having to hold on to land, or there's giving it up with leases, these 99-year leases. So thinking about these as two major processes that people are facing now that are going to directly affect people's relationship to the landscape and the kind of work that we're doing. You could take either one or some combination, but I think we could kind of close off our group discussion that way before we turn to the questions.
Well, Jason, the Chinese strategy for the region is obvious, and they've been very effective historically at spreading China and Chinese families and so forth all around the globe, with the family actually providing funds for children and young adults to go out and start businesses, and then it's a part of the family business. The government has a program like this now, I understand, for young people that want to go, say, start a grocery or another business in Micronesia or other places that the Chinese want to spread their influence. And they're actually the loans are forgivable after a certain period of time if people stay in the enterprise. So they have a very effective means of doing this, but then also as in terms of they're brokering these things on a very on the scale of ownership and mortgage capitalism too, if you will. As you know, a lot of times loans that are defaulted on, Chinese end up taking properties. They're very much involved in the Philippines now. I noticed some questions from Grace Barreto Torsoro on the question line. She's probably seen this too, where in rural areas that reservoirs are being built or oil exploration is being done, the Chinese have taken over large blocks of land and pretty much excluding even locals from going into them. So it's on many fronts, the Chinese influence is more and more pervasive in the region.
Very, very quickly, Jason, on the issue of tourism land leases. So you probably know that in Vanuatu, foreigners cannot own land, and that's written into the constitution at the time of independence. But foreigners can lease land, and that's become problematic. And on Efate in particular, the island where Port Vila is located, a lot of Efate is leased out. The Chinese actually are latecomers. It's the Australians who were there before that. And so what it's done on Efate is that it's increased it increased land prices. It increased real estate prices in those places. But also because of the length of the number of years of the lease, it means that it's virtually alienated because it's leased for 75 to 99 years, and that's beyond the lifetime of most of our folks. And then the other complication is that when the lease is over, in order for land to be returned to what we call customary landowners, they will have to pay for the development that was done to the land. And so if you build a 5-star hotel on a piece of land, and then at the end of the lease, say to landowners, we're really sorry, but you have to pay for the 5-star hotel, it's not going to happen. And so that's a big issue. On the issue of climate change and relocation, that's a major issue, and I know it's happening throughout the Pacific Islands. And at the moment, a lot of the migration, I think, is internal, moving people from the outer islands of Yap, for instance, to the bigger islands, or from the outer islands of Kiribati to Tarawa, which is not bigger than the outer islands of Kiribati, or from the outer islands of the Solomons to places like Guadalcanal, and the same in other parts of the Pacific Islands. And again, central to the relocation and this internal migration is the issue of land, access to land. Land that in a lot of these places doesn't belong to the state. A lot of the land is customary owned. And so the state can't just come in and say, we'll take this piece of land and we'll relocate people from this place to here. So it creates a whole lot of complicated discussions about relocations.
Okay, I was going to say that Tera, that's the exact same situation in Yap. I mean, it's really the same lease structure and plan, and the other difficulty is that people do not own in Yapese communities. It's not that people own big patches of land. It's multiple little patches owned by different clans and lineages and over generations. So who's signing and who has authority to sign and what happens to others who also have claims in that land is very, very complicated, and it's actually hard to know how this will hold up, and I really hope there's ways in the various court cases that will no doubt emerge that local views of this will be upheld, and that the Chinese view of what property is and will not superseded. It's hard to say. I want to shift.
So if I may very quickly, Jason, on the issue of land. So what we're talking about a lot of times is rights to land, and there are different kinds of rights: right of ownership, right of access, right to use land, and right to dispose of land, meaning to pass the title on to other people. And in a lot of traditional Pacific Island societies, or a lot of Pacific Island societies, traditional or whatever, is that all these rights intersect and overlap and exist at the same time, and they are negotiated and so forth. What the lease process and the land registration process have done is they've taken away this complicated relationship between the different rights and privileged the right of ownership. And so when somebody signs the lease with a Chinese company or an Australian company, over time, that person who is supposed to act on behalf of his or her land owning group becomes the sole owner because of the privileging of the right of ownership.
Okay. Yeah, it's very messy, complicated. Let's shift to the questions, because we got about 15 minutes left, and it'd be great to have some of the audience questions brought in. So I'll start with this question. Somebody's asking, they're curious, what is the ratio of local Pacific Island archaeologists with international scholars? So how, in the places where you work, what is this relationship between outside scholars and indigenous scholars? And when power is discussed in storytelling, how do local communities or groups react to stories that they do not agree with, from either, local scholars or international scholars? John, do you want to say something? Or?
Sure. Well, in the Philippines, of course, there's a lot more local archaeologists that are training programs at archaeological studies program at UP Dillman and other places. Others are starting up, and so the ratio of foreign scholars to Philippine scholars is evening out quite a bit. But in places like Pohnpei and Yap, there are people in the Historic Preservation Office. They may have a master's degree, rarely, but occasionally maybe someone who have gone on for a PhD. Unfortunately, when they get a PhD, they get recruited off island, which is really lost to the islands. But even so, there are many, many, many more archaeologists from Australia and the States flocking to the islands. Reminds me of the old Gary Larson cartoon with the natives in the hut grabbing their TV and running to hide, saying, "The anthropologists are coming, the anthropologists are coming." There are many, many more. I'd hesitate to say a number, but maybe 1 to 10, maybe even worse than that. But that may change over time as more and more people go out to get graduate degrees, and as graduate degrees cater to the islanders, like University of Hawaii, Manoa has an anthropology department with Micronesians recruited into it. Now with Boboy at UCLA, there may be more recruitment of people from the Philippines and from Micronesia and so forth. So that seems to be changing a bit over what it was a few years ago.
Tara, did you have a point? I might have cut you off as you were reaching for your.
Oh no, I was going to suggest that John and Britton are probably the ones most qualified to answer that questions.
Yeah, I mean, I can't give you exact numbers either, and it depends. Some of the most established indigenous archaeologists on Easter Island are not by credential, but rather by praxis. Decades and decades of both field and administrative experience, and so I think there's at least 3 I can think of off the top of my head that would fall into that category. In terms of credentialed archaeologists having completed some equivalent of grad school or master's degree, essentially, obviously in South America, because that opportunity doesn't exist yet on Easter Island. I think I know of 2 at this point on Easter Island. And that's in comparison to, I would say, there's got to be any given year at least a dozen foreign archaeologists that set foot on Easter Island to conduct research, and probably twice that number in terms of their graduate proteges, to give some idea of the relationship there. I will say, however, it's if we talk about archaeologists doing research archaeology rather than devoted to policy, conservation, administrative work with cultural resources, neither of those relatively young and credentialed indigenous archaeologists are involved in research archaeology for the most part. They have government positions, and so in that case, there's even a much larger differential in terms of the kind of work that's going on.
Okay. Here's a question. It seems like a difficult one to answer, but I'll put it out there. It says there's an issue of Filipinos in the U.S. Having difficulty in sort of categorizing themselves, since they're being classified as Pacific Islander instead of Asian. What's your opinion on this? And can anyone answer? Thank you.
That's a difficult one. And I think I'll go back to what we were talking about earlier on. Even the term Pacific is something that's given to us. And people have used these terms, taken it and used it for different purposes. In some cases, political. So when Pacific Islanders say the Pacific, a particular place comes into mind. And it goes as far as West Papua, for instance, and borders Indonesia. And that's a very political definition, which again is connected to colonial history as well. The establishment of regional organizations, especially intergovernmental regional organizations that include certain places and exclude others. But you know, I think that it's up to people to define where the Pacific ends or begins, and it's a difficult one. And I know that Filipinos, not just Filipinos, but Indonesians and others often feel either included or excluded from that definition. And if that's the category that the U.S. government or whoever is using, it's interesting to see what's behind those definitions. I'm not sure that answers anything, but yeah.
Not to be cynical, but this has some repercussions for the minority islanders or minority status of the individual and of programs. So like University of Hawaii, University of Guam, where I was working as an administrator, we liked the fact that Filipinos were counted as Pacific Islanders because it increased our standing on minority as a minority institution, and that helps the individuals as well. But as far as identities are concerned, there would be possibly be some conflicts there. So it can work either way, I think.
Yeah. In the other hand, for example, for me, that I consider myself a Pacific Islander, a while ago was trying to look for a scholarship to get a visa to go to Aotearoa in New Zealand, right? And there was actually one for Pacific Islanders. And when I went to look for Easter Island or Rapa Nui as a Pacific Island, I was considered South American because Easter Island is in Polynesia, but belongs to Chile, which is in South America, right? And that's when I got. I don't know if it's answer anything, but it also happens in the other way where maybe that's why Britain said like maybe just one single archaeologist that works in a government position in Easter Island. But if we would had more opportunities for scholarships in Hawaii or in Aotearoa by being considered Pacific Islander as Polynesians, I mean, it will be a huge opportunity for us, for our community.
Okay, here's another question. Some of the comments and insights from the panelists point to power dynamics of capitalist forces. For example, what products are promoted and sold to the communities there, and the tourism industry being overrepresented. So my quick question is, are any of the panelists aware of emerging, locally driven, diverse, and sustainable microeconomies that can perhaps one day supplant tourism?
So if I may very quickly, and that's something that's been talked about since COVID-19 started. So there's a huge discussion going on in the Pacific and amongst Pacific Islanders and many different Zoom communities. And the discussion centered largely around the issue of alternative approaches to development for Pacific Island places and people. Because although COVID-19 as a health issue hasn't hit the Pacific in the way that it has other places, it's affected Pacific Island economies very badly, especially the countries that are dependent on tourism, like Fiji, Palau, Vanuatu, and so forth. And because of an economy that's dependent on people coming in who no longer come as a result of COVID-19. And so there's an ongoing discussion that most of it is not spearheaded by government. It's communities, groups, churches. There's one by the Pacific Islands Council of Churches, for instance, that resulted in the publication of a book called From the Deep. It's available online, and you can, you can get it for free. So there's a lot of discussion on what kind of development approach is affordable and viable for Pacific Island places. I've been part of some of that discussion. I must say that I don't think we have found the answer as yet, but that discussion is continuing. And the question is, I think, valid and important to that discussion.
There's some huge opportunities in aquaculture, and we were exploring some grants, for example, for fish farming of mo'i, like big pens out of the sea. A lot of problems have to be solved, but I think there's a lot of potential for that. The fisheries, and that's a whole other complicated issue about who the fishery, the pelagic fish are leased to and so forth. But as far as being able to operate both local lagoonal systems, like some people in Palau are starting, or maybe ocean penning, like was being proposed in the Marshall Islands and Pohnpei. There's some huge opportunities there, really could be explored.
I was just going to say quickly with Micronesia, I mean, the looming end of the Compact of Free Association for the Federated States of Micronesia 2023 is a huge issue. And then so where you get to go for, those kinds of resources to start up these alternates are becoming increasingly a problem, but we'll see what happens.
I doubt it will end, Jason. I think they're already negotiating for the continuing of the compact. If the Chinese keep coming, the compact will keep going.
Yeah, I agree. Benno, did you want to?
Yeah, I think obviously because I work in tourism industry, we've been in so many conversations that since we depend on travelers, my island, the whole economy of my island, it also depends on tourism. Here in our company, we've been discussing so much about what's the new shift that the customer or the traveler it's looking, and that make us think of what are the really stakeholders for this. We've been saying that we have a model so fragile. There's something like this with the COVID. It's being closed in so many places. I mean, if companies they're not closed totally, or they're declared bankruptcy, it's huge, and it's been probably helping us to our idea of how we develop the type of travel that we want. With COVID, it just enhanced the point of view of how do you look of your stakeholders. And when you look at the society, I mean, we need to look into the environment, climate change, and how it's an impact. I cannot see anybody traveling soon to any of those probably resorts in Cancun with, I don't know, 500 rooms and stuff like that. I mean, that kind of tourism, it will be very difficult. And what we do, we build lodges with 20 rooms. We build lodges, and the first department that it's in the property is the biology department, where the biologists set up the place, and they just start getting agreed and start doing all the projects. And the success of some of our properties is that we've been discovered new species for science. I mean, it's a huge reward for what we do, and having just 20 rooms for people to come and to go and explore and see these places, it just helps us to do the research that we're doing and to do and affect all the community, the environment around it. So I think it's just a huge also opportunity of see again the way of how you travel and how aware are you as a traveler the impact that you're causing to the environment. So I don't know, we're very fragile industry right now, and it's super sad, obviously. But at the same time, so we just see this as a huge opportunity to keep doing what we're doing in the way that we're trying to do it the best.
All right, so that brings us to 9 o'clock, and I just want to thank each and every one of the panelists for this discussion. I just learned so much, and I just really appreciate you taking the time and your presence and your wisdom, and so thank you so much for that. And I'll cede the Zoom floor to my good friend Stephen.
Well, thank you, everyone. I just wish we had more time, but I think we've reached the end of the panel. So again, thank you for these enlightening discussions. There's still a lot of things to do in terms of engaging the communities that we work with, but we have 4 more panels that will talk about how they engage the communities that they work with. So next week we'll have indigenous issues, which Justin Donovan is moderating, and so we invite you to attend next week's panel again. Maddie?
Yes, thank you to our moderator and all of our panelists for participating in our 6th panel of the webinar series. Like Dr. Kabuta said, we would like to promote our 7th panel, which is happening same time, same place next week, on the topic of indigeneity, identity, and empowerment. So we'll have, like he said, Justin Donovan will be our moderator, and our panelists will feature a variety of archaeologists, anthropologists, and community members to really get talking about even to further our conversation on these really important topics. If you have been following along for this entire webinar, we invite you to click the link for our survey. If you fill out the survey, you can give us some feedback on our event. We're continuously improving based on your engagement, and you can also receive an e-certificate for your participation. We're always happy to have you here, to have your comments, to have your questions. And so we really appreciate any bit that you can, provide to us to let us know how you're enjoying these webinars that we've been putting on. And I think that pretty much wraps up our webinar today. Anything else, Dr. Kabuta? Nope, but so we'll see you next week at panel 7.
Salamat, mahalo, kamangar.
Yorana.